Without further ado, then, I'd like to officially open this conference and ask you to please join me in welcoming our first speaker, who's Professor Peng Laikwan. Professor Peng is Choh-Ming Lee Professor of Cultural and Religious Studies and Chairperson of the Department of Cultural and Religious Studies at Chinese University, Hong Kong. Her research spans a broad spectrum of issues related to culture in modern contemporary China and Hong Kong. Her central philosophical project is the exploration of the dynamics between many and one, manifested in the intersections between culture and politics, copies and models, plurality and unity, as well as democracy and sovereignty. She is the author of numerous books, and her scholarship has been recognized internationally, receiving prizes from the American Library Association, the Chiang King-Kuo Foundation Publication Award. And her talk today is entitled, that's me, Sovereign Logic, Decolonial Politics, and the Problematic Logic of Unity.
So what I need to do is to press.
Oh, just forward, just this.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much for this wonderful opportunity for me to speak here. I have a soft voice. Are you able to hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. So this is my topic, and I'm going to start. The concept of sovereignty might be one of the most problematic yet empowering concepts in today's political world, a concept underpinning both democracy and nationalism, resistance and hegemony. All over the world, states and the people reiterate their rights to sovereignty, identifying and condemning the intervention of internal and external forces that allegedly steal their autonomy. The Brexit politics, for example, in this country is one of the most prominent examples recently, demonstrating what sovereignty could be a powerful concept among the popular imagination. We know that as globalization retreats, the nation states has now become, becoming once again, the most powerful actor on the international stage, which I have to say is an ominous sign. A politics based on self-interests without common values would only bring the world into further fragmentation, if not downright conflicts. While I am most critical of China's sovereign logic from Hong Kong's, as you can imagine, I do think that a careful theorization of sovereignty is a much needed project around the world. That is to say that my project has its own specific political, cultural context, which is China's kind of situations. But I do think that it has universal ramifications that I am going to talk about primarily today. So I'd like to separate this presentation into into three sections: politics of unity, sovereignty and decoloniality, as well as sovereignty in the futures of critique. And hopefully this presentation will offer us some fruits for thought to navigate the troubled waters of our time. How much time do we have?
Like 40, 50 minutes, but then 70 altogether.
So you will, are you going to prompt me when I'm
I will.
Somewhere around?
Yes.
Like 40 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, no major theorists in the West, probably with the possible exception of the anarchists, have denied the importance of the state in exercising sovereign power and protecting the body politic. Indeed, even Karl Marx placed the withering of the state in the distant utopian future. The state is still the most important form of political community in modern society, and the people express their political rights mostly via the state. Gathering so much power, the state can only legitimize itself through the claim of sovereignty. This leads to the highly problematic circular logic of modern sovereignty. In order to maintain the people's sovereignty, we must protect state sovereignty. Or, in order to end a hegemonic sovereignty, we need to develop yet another one. So questions related to state sovereignty are mostly questions related to collective self-governance as well as its necessary evil. Modern state sovereignty was established, arguably, in the 17th century around the Westphalia Treaties, many of us know, with the purpose of denying outside powers the possibility of ruling the people. It must seek legitimacy internally, and modern state sovereignty also becomes self-legitimizing. While we need to equate sovereignty, we tend to equate sovereignty as state sovereignty. We must be reminded that sovereignty does not describe only the state, but it primarily means self-governing, so that groups with different political ambitions or those who have a sense of belongings might also evince a will to sovereignty. The many forms of sovereignties could be in conflict with each other. Consider, for example, the antagonism between the indigenous people and the settler colonizers in many countries, as well as those between, for example, an individual and his or her family. In both cases, we see conflicts of sovereignties. These many levels of sovereignty often become so entangled that they could not and should not be separated too quickly. Each case needs its own contextualization. So what I'm trying to say is that even though the term sovereignty has this negative connotation, we have to start with questions and start with a sense of problematics instead of criticizing it too eagerly. Self-control, as I said, is primarily what it means by sovereignty, can be understood on two levels. Externally, it rejects other people's attempts to command oneself, and internally, it celebrates the self-management of impulses, emotions, and conduct for the sake of higher goals. This comprises a good part of our moral education, resist others and hold on to one's autonomy. But scaling this behaviorism up to the state level, for example, we would find that discussion of state sovereignty often also hinge on a dual structure, externally against foreign interference and internally against domestic disorder. Indeed, our imagination of sovereignty tends to be based on a coherent and confident individual, capable of managing and controlling one's own self. Needless to say, this conception of individual dovetails with Western liberal individualism. However, where is it? Sorry, why was I here? Okay. Because the state is composed of, I'm getting confused. Okay, because the state is composed of many individuals, the state as the representation of the people implies a power transaction, in the sense that the modern state operates through citizens' voluntary transference of their autonomy to the state. Collecting the power of the citizens, the state could become coercive due to and despite these originating forces. It is often difficult to differentiate the sovereignty belongs to me from I belong to the sovereignty. This sovereign logic echoes the possessive propensity of private property ownership, giving rise to the idea that I own and I am also entitled to any value associated with my country. Such sovereignty is nothing about equality. Women are often considered objects instead of subjects of sovereignty, while the sovereignty of indigenous groups is often encroached by hostile political and economic forces. To deter the state from collecting all the power, activists and artists have promoted different kinds of indigenous rights, as we know that. And also, critics, including myself, had also urged us to refocus back on the sovereign agency of the individual political actor, as well as the collectives they form. But such approach, as I mentioned, actually runs the risk of overemphasizing the agency and the liberty of the enlightened South. So there's the ultimate contradictions within the politics of sovereignty, because you're always ultimately emphasizing the unity of an individual. Either it is an individual person or individual group. And the problems arise out of that assumption. Unity and permanence are central to discourses of sovereignty that are often built around the logic of the self. The more demanding political task is to understand the necessary entanglement of different levels of sovereignty and to deal with the resulting disagreements and conflicts. It is also through a critique of sovereignty can we gain a more profound view of the connection between liberalism and authoritarianism. Not only are they different, but I have to say they're also similar in the sense that both are related to the unity and autonomy of the self. On the one hand, the unity of the right-bearing free individual, and on the other hand, the unity of the state. This is the reason why while we should critique the assumptions behind liberalism, we cannot jump to a wholesale denunciation of personal liberty and end up endorsing collectivism or authoritarianism. Because in a way, we need one to critique the other. The individual needs to open up itself to others, while the state must also positively acknowledge its own internal authority. And most importantly, the critic, like all of us, must also resist entrenched in either one of them. Go back to China. China's current sovereign logic, so are the situations of some other authoritarian countries, displays a strong animosity towards liberalism, where state economy and collective good matter more than personal liberty. China's rapid economic development in the last 3 decades, as interpreted by many critics, proves the effectiveness of this sovereign logic. But the Chinese state has clearly exploited the people's willingness to negotiate personal liberty. The grave consequences of the state's enormous power in intruding into their private life, I'm talking about China, has been painfully felt by the Chinese citizens in the recent COVID-19 lockdown, for example. Our task, or my task, is not to dichotomize authoritarianism or liberalism, and liberalism, knowing that each could be contaminated by the other in different ways, but to navigate and work through the entanglement to develop a more just and benevolent political space.
Excuse me, could you just move the lectern a bit further back because you can't see the text at the bottom right. Thank you so much.
Is it better?
I suppose so. When text appears, we know.
Are you okay? Okay. Okay. We must also differentiate sovereignty from government. Each sovereignty is composed of a government. We all know that. Yet the sovereign and the government are clearly not the same thing. While the sovereign is the body that owns sovereignty, which is highly abstract. I mean, sovereignty is a very abstract concept, I have to say. The government itself is an assemblage of concrete institutions with diversified bureaus, agendas, functions, and locations. In terms of the actual operations of the government, the state could be very fragile, but its bureaucracy is often far less efficient and powerful than the sovereign power would claim and hope. But the state's sovereignty does not necessarily suffer from the bureaucracy. Both the state and its critics tend to overstate the unity and the power of the state, while the government often fails to achieve its ambitions. Many states, whether democratic or autocratic, suffers from bureaucracy and incompetence. In fact, many patriotic Chinese citizens, for example, are highly critical of the inefficiency and sometimes corruption of their local governments. But they tend to separate the mundane bureaucracy from the central government, which embodies state sovereignty. So state sovereignty in that case is clearly separated from the government. So the state is both a quotidian government and a symbolic site of sovereign power. And the latter is conjured by countless citizens who identify with it and submit to its authority. The government's day-to-day operation, on the other hand, might be inefficient, but this does not cancel out the original power of the sovereignty that existed prior to the institutions. In the work of the anthropologist Audra Simpson, who works on indigenous rights, she said, only critique can help us distinguish between sovereignty as Western exceptionalism and dominance, and sovereignty as indigenous belonging, dignity, and justice. Accepting and modifying Simpson's recommendation to describe my own project, I would say that only critique can help us distinguish sovereignty as state exceptionalism and dominance, and sovereignty as sensible collective governance based on justice, plurality, adaptation to external change. To me, scholarly critique not only betrays the innate complexity of all sovereignty claims, but also encourages us not to shy away from offering informed and difficult moral political judgment. I'm moving to my second part of the speech, which is about decolonialism or decoloniality. A key concern of this conference, I believe, is decoloniality. I suggest to incorporate the discussions of sovereignty to these discussions of decolonialism for us to be more critical of the many decolonial critics of politics that is being circulating today, which end up promoting and endorsing the hegemony. In fact, state sovereignty is the drive and the end of many decolonial movements, as we know, but attainment of such, that is to say, the successful of the decolonial revolution, often does not spell the end of social injustice. Instead, dystopia is more often the result, as David Scott claims, almost everywhere. The anti-colonial utopias have gradually withered into post-colonial nightmares. One way to stay alert to such dissolution and not be lured into a cynicism is to be aware that unity is never the reality or the options of decolonial politics. From Stuart Hall to Edward Glissant and David Scott, I just quoted, these Caribbean post-colonial theorists, for example, introduce us to a set of decolonial politics that emphasize aleatory forms, creolizations, and hybridizations over dichotomized thinking. Because there can be no return to an indigenous past in these places. As Stuart Hall asserts, the Caribbeans share the experience of a profound discontinuity. The peoples dragged into slavery, transportation, colonization, migration came predominantly from Africa. And when that supply ended, it was temporarily refreshed by indentured labor from the Asian subcontinent. Most importantly, the European presence, although in the form of the colonizer, is also fundamental. As he said, quote, the European presence interrupts the innocence of the whole discourse of difference in the Caribbean by introducing the question of power. End of quote. Glissant also reminds us that the Creolophone of in the Caribbean is a very active language made up of constant integration of the multitude of the African languages and European languages and constant forgettings of such integration. The European presence being both a destructive and a constitutive element in the Caribbean identity propels the critics to engage with the interweaving history of power and resistance, of refusal and recognition, and to recognize that the Caribbean is always already fused and synchronized. Unity, therefore, should not be the end of decolonial politics. Instead, decolonialism could be a method to deconstruct the myth of unity. Indeed, a critical recognition of the presence of the colonial in the post-colonial is an effective politics to avoid the hegemony of state sovereignty in a post-colonial situation. Back to Hong Kong, where I come from. It is also a former British colony. I was the former colonizer of this country, without an authentic past it can return to. Its reunification with the PRC in 1997 has also complicated the idea of post or decolonial politics. Hong Kong also differs much from the Caribbean, as I just mentioned. Here in Hong Kong, the British never engaged in slavery or massive relocation in this trade port, and much of its urban history since 1841, when the population of Hong Kong Island was only about 7,500, it was always already been under British governance since then. We can call Hong Kong's urban development a colonial modernity. As Tani Malo has reminded us, many East Asian people experience colonialism, modernity, and capitalism all at the same time. We need to pay attention to the many effects of colonialism, and it helps us produce more complex historical writing rather than continuing the conventions of binding historical knowledge in strictly opposed parts, such as self and other, state and nation, colony, and metropole. Elmo Gonzaga also explains that the U.S. colonial government in the Philippines has been remembered by many Filipinos as one that introduced technological and infrastructural advances commonly recognized as modern, as he said, quote, as the new regime, that is the American colonization, extensively and effectively renovated spaces, structures, bodies, and practice with modern norms, Filipinos came to equate modernity with the United States, problematic or not. Annabelle Cojano rightly criticized that this kind of modernity is heavily Eurocentric, prescribing the West as necessarily more civilized than the rest. But we should also avoid totalizing colonization as one. For example, the Japanese colonial experience in Taiwan differ those from the colonial experience in Korea, both colonized by Japan. So were the cases of British colonialism in India, in contrast to those in Singapore, for example, which partly explains a different colonial memory and attachment in these places. We must be critical of the term colonization being increasingly used as a monolithic power structure, suggesting absolute evilness and pure victimhood. While British colonialism, as well as its law, is an integral part of Hong Kong and other former colonial world, we might find productive elements in the British legal history and the British analytic philosophy to respond to, first, the British colonial history on the one hand, and secondly, the new post-colonial sovereignty that is from China. This is a worthwhile project, I think, not because the British legal or philosophical traditions necessarily possesses any superior value, but because it offers perspectives different yet relevant to the new sovereign power, which is China. As David Scott, again, I'm quoting him, explains his decolonial project of writing conscripts of modernity. That is his quote, "The old languages of moral political vision and hope are no longer in sync with the world they were meant to describe and normatively criticizes. But if what is at stake in critically thinking through this post-colonial present is not simply the naming of yet another horizon and the fixing of the teleological plot that takes us from here, still, what is at stake is something like a refusal to be seduced and immobilized by the factual normalizations of the present." Scott's decolonial project is not to construct a new future defined by alternative ideas, but to go back to history and construct many problem spaces, meaning discursive contexts where particular questions and answers were allowed to be raised and considered worth raising. It is through such investigations might we free ourselves from the current normative framework. As such, a critique of totalistic thinking applies not only to sovereign logic, but also to decoloniality too, to prevent us from being normalized by the power structure of the status quo, which the old languages of moral political vision could no longer validly criticize. We should also resist the temptations of prescribing a fixed future, which will equally deplete our political imagination. At a time when decolonial studies busily criticizing all knowledge and discourse production oriented in the West, we also risk the fascizations of no-code knowledge, which itself for sure contains hegemonic components. Instead of quickly criticizing the ways post-colonial subjects around the world attaching to European values to seek local justice as complicitous with the British colony or global capitalism, we might see appropriation itself an act of decolonialization. Historically, the colonial population was never passive. They often collaborated with and resisted authority through the same set of laws and practices. The colonized subjects were both controlled and empowered by the colonizers at the same time. We must be careful not to develop a set of colonial theories that end up simplifying and totalizing colonialism. Now moving on to my third section related to this conference, related to the futures of critique. Sovereignty as the source of power over a body politics is an indispensable concept in both realpolitik and the practice of democracy, as I mentioned in the beginning of the talk. In the name of autonomy and unity, state sovereignty has produced a range of positive and negative outcomes and repercussions, from democracy to xenophobia, germinating both solidarity and suppression. While we probably can never do away with sovereignty in the political world, we must remind ourselves that any attempt to develop a permanent and fixed sovereignty is bound to fail, precisely because sovereignty represents the self-ruling power of a group of living people whose differences and constant mutilations are irreducible. Our challenge is to realize a collective sovereignty that does not sacrifice plurality and changes in the name of representation or a desire for permanence and unity. As Derrida claims, the choice is not between sovereignty and non-sovereignty, but among several forms of partings, partitions, division, conditions that come along to broach a sovereignty that is always supposed to be indivisible and unconditional. Critics have pointed out, often convincingly, the importance of weaker states asserting their sovereignty, which I totally agree. But we must remember any sovereignty should also be a weak one, therefore a porous one. It is true that capitalism traverses state borders and accentuates global inequality. It is also true that the polarizing social media and the democratizations of knowledge have destabilized all hard-won normality and authority. But a totalizing state sovereignty should not be the answer. Many people are losing their capacity to work together as a polity to exercise and gain collective wisdom to solve political problems, which we are seeing in every part of our world pretty much. But strong sovereignty discourses rising around the world also fall short of such high expectations. As the allure of globalization wanes, many people around the world desire a sovereign power that is not built from the bottom up through difficult negotiation, but one composed of collective emotions and exclusive pedigree, one that provides permanent security. At the same time, many political leaders also take advantage of such sentiments to encourage their citizens to identify with them and follow their version of order. In the name of unifying the people, resisting external threats, or holding down a prosperous nation to the next generation, many state leaders democratically elected or not, are basically absolutizing and essentialized us versus others. Sovereignty is a political structure that provides the stability and identity that many people need and desire. But bracketing situations where sovereignty is indeed endangered or lost, such as the case of certain indigenous groups, I would say that the flagging of sovereignty as a state principle is not necessarily providing a useful guidance or ideal for the government and the people to navigate internal and external politics. We vividly observe the deterioration of global political and ecological environment. I'm sure we'll be talking about it in the rest of the days. We are also caught in the doomed prospect of the ever more intense competition promoted by late capitalism. Many of our most urgent tasks in contemporary politics are transborder and cooperative in nature, such as the solutions to climate change, methods of alleviating global inequality, and the best ways to continue to develop artificial intelligence. Situated in a world trenched in ideological clashes and economic competitions, we must safeguard deliberation and empathy. We also need to make arduous and risky decisions supported by elaborated discussions and strenuous debates via plural and contested perspectives. Sovereignty tempts us to bypass these difficult processes, engaging political decisions only through the calculations of self-interest and natural bonding would push us further away from partnerships and responsibility. While my recent book is devoted to the logic of sovereignty in China, the underlying concerns are universal. The unpredictability, systematic breakdown, and disobedience found in modern Chinese history happened in many other places too. The ways these ruptures have been both the pretext for the sovereign to demand unity and the evidence of the chimerical nature of such demands also observed worldwide. There is an intimate relation between fear of change and desire for sovereignty. The more political and social changes people have experienced, the more they crave certainty, organizations, and safety, and the more attractive a strong sovereign logic becomes. This also explains why a survival anxiety could so effectively hold the people together under the vague promises of sovereignty. Similar to the historical trajectories of many third world countries, modern sovereignty in China was initiated in the late Qing period by its anxiety about the survival of the Chinese race. That was 100 years ago. Although China has now become such a powerful country and it is no longer a concern that the entire people would be wiped out, as it was 150 years ago, the discourse of survival continues to thrive, now through the names of the individuals or in the names of the families, that everybody was worried that they cannot survive or the families cannot survive. The people have continued to consider survival and to a lesser extent prosperity the main, if not sole, purpose of politics. To me, this kind of survival-based sovereignty is clearly not unique to China. Indeed, politicians around the world are exploiting such rhetoric. But the survival threats we are now facing are increasing planetary in nature, and we must recognize or reconceptualize survival not in terms of competitions, but entanglement between peoples and nations. We do not need a sovereign logic that is washed over by the anxiety of the fall of a state, because what is falling is all of humanity. The more meaningful political project to me is to implement collective wisdoms to promote the diversity of lives. Not only this can guarantee the continual survival of the individual people and the humankind in general. Instead of being overwhelmed by the fear of death, so to speak, anyway, we should try to affirm life and the changes it brings. I do not propose to give up state sovereignty altogether, but I urge us to develop a more porous, multi-layered, and communicative sovereignty that can engage with and benefit the people and things outside and inside the state border. Undeniably, as I have mentioned, the sovereign states are now the most important players determining the future of our planet. On the world stage, sovereign states are likely to be even more aggressive in wanting to clash with each other on behalf of the people. Within the states, we may also expect more frequent and assertive uses of the sovereign logic by those in power, in the name of the people, but actually targeted against the people. Living in such a political reality, our duty is to loosen up the concepts of unity and autonomy that defines sovereignty. Sadly, the COVID pandemic showed an intensification of such parochialism and contestations. Instead of experimenting with new global cooperation and fairer vaccine distributions, national borders, as we remember, were quickly closed, and states rushed to develop their own vaccines, not only as medicine, but also as a source of national pride. A strong sovereign might have protected the lucky and the obedient majority, but it is also more than ready to punish those who are not in compliance. Okay, I'm moving to the end. Instead of reducing difficult political practices into one identification, we can foreground the people's intersubjective relations towards a spawning life power. We can also experiment with new concepts of ownerships and mastery that are regenerating rather than oxifying, appreciating both the importance and the limitations of borders. Solidarity is not a given. A lasting solidarity can only be constructed based on the efforts of constantly opening up to the uniqueness of each individual member as well as the accidents of histories. Constructing and protecting and embracing political community that respects the individuality of each member and embraces the potentialities the world advances is a very difficult political project, we must admit. But it is also one that deserves our continuing efforts. That's the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
So we have plenty of time for questions, so I'd just like to open it up to the floor. Yes.
Thank you for that, yeah. My question is around why we still need sovereignty as a concept that's important for critical theory or for kind of critical, project of critique. And I think maybe a way to try to work through what you presented here, you yourself, as you've pointed out, that there's this kind of increasingly mired distinction between liberalism and authoritarianism, or what you could call this kind of new versions or forms of neoliberal authoritarianism that we see emerging everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. From whether it's Biden is the real Trump, or Trump is Trump, or whether it's here, or whether it's in Modi, or all over. We can recount various versions of this perverse form of new authority, or that is precisely making claims to sovereignty.
Yes, exactly.
So it's the sovereignty that needs to be defended, and hence politics is just an organization around the political function of the state as a representation. Right. So I think my question is, and it's becoming clear, as you said, that liberalism is falling into this kind of perverse logic of sovereignty that is there from the start. So, I guess my question is, why do we need the concept of sovereignty?
Yes, that's the
why do we need it for critique? Why is it, obviously Derrida thinks we need it, but one can have a discussion about whether Derrida's project is a critical one or not. But so why would we need it? Sovereignty, why would critique not seek for fundamental concepts like justice, equality? So my question is really, why sovereignty? That's why still try to hold on to that concept? Especially after, I'm sorry, it's a longer comment, but in the background, Schmidt, the nomos of the earth, this is, we are in a Schmittian century. This is what we're witnessing. So so why not revert? And in a sense, what I'm saying is here, why not actually stick to some kind of core of Marx's critique of the logic of sovereignty from the start. I mean, the idea that the state, we can't have an account of sovereignty of the state without an account of capital, and hence we have to have an account of totality, and hence if we want to think about colonization, we also have to have an account of that. So I suppose it's a question about concepts here. What are the concepts that we need to hold on to?
Okay, that's a very important and key concern of my project. Okay, as I said, it started from a Hong Kong's perspective, even though my book was not really about Hong Kong as such. It talks about China. And we do know that in the case of China, starting with China first, it is sovereignty that is the ultimate political ideology or political principle that governs its positions with domestically and internationally. It is always sovereignty as a politics or as a principle that is legitimizing everything. Okay, so that's my original question. That I want to know why. Why do we need to hold on to sovereignty, exactly as you said? But then the more I looked at the logic, and the more I feel like exactly this is a concept that no one can really escape. Let me put it this way. Any political community at the end of the day cannot really escape the concept of sovereignty if we want to conceptualize a group of people who want to have some kind of self-governance to differentiate this collective from others. We can obviously say that the earth, human being, is itself a sovereign subject. That's one way of saying it. But we can also say, for example, in the case of a lot of indigenous population, sovereignty is such a core concept in a lot of indigenous discussion these days against precisely why I need to bring decolonialism into the discussions, because a lot of decolonial politics at present emphasize sovereignty as something that is being lost, as something being intruded, as something being fought. So this is not something we can just, this is a very good reminder of myself that I cannot just, forget about the concept, because it's also essential to politics or self-governing of a people. So that is the reason why I think that it also explains the allure of sovereignty around the world. Why is, for example, the concept of sovereignty so essential to Brexit in this country, or to, the French presidential elections? Everybody is talking about, in Europe, for example, the contestations between one nation and European Union, for example, and many other places emphasize sovereignty all the time. So my question is, I do not want to go that extreme. I think, as I said, mentioned, even Marx would say that let's leave it at the utopian end when the withering of the state really happened. But at this moment, even Marx would say that we cannot not hold on to the state to some extent. So that was my frustrations, and also my little enlightenment that this is all problematic, but at the same time we cannot just lose it. Particularly in a time, as I mentioned, where we are talking about climate change and a lot of discussions happening internationally, the state is really holding on to a lot of power. If we simply say that, let's forget about sovereignty, then we are not really dealing with the actual situations where the state represents the people and they talk on the international platforms about the future of our planet. So how do we deal with this necessary evil? Is my project at this moment. But I really thank for your question, because you really help me to articulate the core difficulties and problematics here. Thank you very much.
So unfortunately my back was turned this way, but I saw Dilip and you. I don't know who was first, but
it doesn't really matter. You could go ahead.
Okay, yeah. So regarding China's politics, I'm just wondering if the concept about authoritarianism or liberalism is just a concept, because China's situation is very complicated. It's a tribal society, so it's much like Africa or South America, because there's a variance fraction and even like more than 30 provinces, they have their own kind of ethnics. So I just wondering, to use this concept just apply to a very complicated political situation that is suitable, or to some extent for such kind of larger continent country, is it necessary to use sort of authority or even use the concept of sovereignty to keep the unity, or to avoid the sort of split or even civil war? Yeah.
Yes, and there are two questions here. First, sovereignty is not my concept, it's the PRC's concept. It is a state ideology, state principle, it's a sacrosanct. That we know that. I mean, those of us who are in the international politics, for example, even if you do not know China, even though anytime China is involved in any international conflicts, Chinese government would say, this is our sovereignty. Don't intrude into our sovereignty. Sovereignty is so frequently, or probably the most frequently used concept as a state discourse. And that's why I'm very frustrated. I have been extremely frustrated, as you said. But this is the reality that we are seeing, and a lot of people buy into that politics. And so the book that I just wrote was precisely about how to deconstruct it through a historical kind of framework. So that's one thing. And the other thing about whether China is itself a continent, I wouldn't say so. China is so powerful these days, well, in the last 30 years, or even 70 years, it's due precisely of its extremely strong state. It has the most, I would say, the strongest state among all countries because of a lot of historical reasons. And its state was able to enter the individual's life from birth to death. So the state is everywhere in people's life in the sense that it is able to maintain its authority. It's very specific to China. Despite its huge population, that is another core problem of China. Is in spite of its diversity, plurality, and extremely prominent regionalism, the state was able to hold on to it. But for how long, to what extent, how much technology is able to help it pull these things together, these people together, is an unknown. But at this point, we do know that it is so powerful that no dissident voices can be heard. There's a lot of dissident voices on the ground, but it is not able to come up and solidify it into a movement yet. Why? It's precisely because of the very strong state of China. It can be compared to India, it can be compared to the British, or even compared to the United States, but the compositions, the political compositions, and the history of China is very unique and, in a way, very powerful. Success.
Actually, I'd like to go back to the first question, which I agreed with completely, but I'd like to take it in a different direction. I think when we talk about the idea of sovereignty and the way you speak about it, there are also the multiple histories of violence, colonialism, and so on. And so we inherit those histories. We need to engage with.
Yes.
So to persist with using the idea of sovereignty, particularly in colonized spaces, Hong Kong, India, parts of Africa, sovereignty is presented to us as a ruse. It's a ruse of sovereignty. When we think ruse, it's a kind of trick. It's the illusion, right, with which decolonized countries function. Because they function within a larger international political economy where sovereignty is denied. Right? So you think about structural adjustment, you could think about multiple factors like that. So what is the point of sticking with an idea like sovereignty at that level where when you talk about climate change and global warming, you say, well, the solution would come to us from states. We need these states, but that's not where the solution is going to come from. It's going to come from popular movements, it's going to come from elsewhere, it's going to come from other imaginations. Right?
Yes.
So, may I just finish? So then the question here is that of the indigenous, which appeared as a gesture in your talk, right? It's not something that's actually spelled out. So how do we then engage with the idea of the indigenous, particularly in terms of our refusal or our lack of self-confidence in our spaces to think, or even the temerity to generate conceptual categories from our spaces? We continue to work with these already sordid categories, like sovereignty. And so therefore the question arises, how do we go back to the experience of colonialism which denied us, created an amnesia about our intellectual traditions, whether it's in China, Africa, India, and so on, where the notions of sovereignty within quotes might be quite different.
Exactly,
So for example, I would not use the term sovereignty even when talking about, and for me it's not something that's useful because it comes from a particular history which we are asked to deny. That's the only way we can engage with it. So in India, for example, when we think about the king is less a James Bond style figure, he's more a Woody Allen style figure, right? Somebody who's constantly anxious because the king is expected to work with a cosmic order, but this also has the injunction to impose violence. So that there's this constant anxiety about the position of the king where this notion of sovereignty is impossible. Right?
No, you're asking a lot of questions.
No, it's the same question actually, it's just facets of it.
Yeah.
So the fundamental thing is, how do we develop our own categories for understanding our politics? Because like Bakhtin said, words come to us not from dictionaries, but from the mouths of people, right? So how do we get back there?
I am not trying to articulate sovereignty as the politics. What I am trying to do is to deconstruct it. I think I should make it clear at this point. I'm saying that we should not deny sovereignty too easily. That's my point. Because this is something a lot of people are fighting for. Right? In Taiwan, for example, they are fighting for sovereignty. In Palestine, for example, they are fighting for sovereignty.
But what are the words then? What are the words in Taiwan? What are the words in Palestine?
In Taiwan, they use sovereignty. I should not claim.
There are no indigenous words at all.
Okay, that's fine. I'm not trying to develop a politics for the world. This is not, I am not capable and I don't want to do it. What I'm trying to say is that we should be critical of this word precisely because it is so powerful. It has been so much used in Europe. You're totally right. My book is about a deconstruction of this word with a very central Eurocentric concept that came to China. I, of course, didn't talk about the whole history of it. So that was my beginning point. And I am not saying none of what I want to say is to impose a politics of sovereignty to the rest of the world. This is not what I want to do, and this I totally denounce myself from. But I just want to say that this is a powerful concept we cannot ignore. This is a power discourse and myth that is operating around the world. It might not be a certain part of the decolonial world, but that concept was also used in different decolonial politics, I understand. So I really am not imposing in India, for example, or in other parts of the world. I'm saying this word is so powerful because of some reason. And to a certain degree, I do think that we cannot escape the core. It might not be the concept of sovereignty, but the core idea of sovereignty, which is a self-legitimization of a group of people with their own political power against others and within itself. The core idea is core idea of politics. We might not use the same word here. I agree with you, it has a lot of political burdens because of our imperial history, our global adoption of the European concept. But let's not let's go back to the history. As I was trying to refer to, what did I say, Stuart Hall and also David Scott, go back to the problem spaces. And those problem spaces defined our world. So yes, if you're able to come up with a different concept or problematics that would be more useful, I would respect a lot, but this is really not what I am currently doing. Yeah, thank you very much for your question.
So 2 questions, Sumi, and then...
Thanks very much, Mang, for your talk. Actually, I think I have 2 questions, but they are largely they are linked. And that's to do with and I could sort of see the carefulness around, or the caution around navigating difficulties around authoritarianism, liberalism, and so on. And I think and then at some point you were sort of talking about avoiding totalistic thinking. And I want to kind of press you a little bit on that. Not so much around thinking about totalistic, thinking about authoritarianism and so on, but actually around decolonial work. And you did sort of go very quickly through it, but I'd like you to maybe just say a little bit more about how you're thinking about, because of course all anti-colonial scholarship or post-colonial is not decolonial. They are quite distinct. But I just wanted to hear you say a little bit more about how you are thinking about the difficulty around what you call totalistic thinking in decolonial scholarship, and how you sort of see your own intervention in that. The other one is to also linked in some ways, but it's slightly different, which is to think in terms of the connections, again, that navigating that difficulties around authoritarianism, liberalism, and so on, that you started your talk with, because you said sovereignty is very much linked to questions of liberalism, particularly around that dual, the logic of the hyper-individual within certain sections of liberalism and liberal theory, then is the model around which state ideas of state sovereignty are constructed, and so on and so forth. And but actually, there's a paradox, isn't there, in the sense that if that I'm not disputing that that's the case, but there is a paradox that we see in action, since you talked about the practice of state sovereignty, that you have on the one hand hyper-individualistic or models of the sort of atomistic, self-sufficient, that very hyper-individualist model, which informs ideas of state sovereignty, right? But at the same time, those strong sovereign states deny the very same individuality to their citizens on the ground, and you see the kind of constrictions of democratic spaces across the globe in real time as it happens. I mean, you see it all around. You see it in university spaces. You see it, and not even talk about the global south, in the global north. Week on week, you see more and more legislation which constricts that space. And I wonder actually what's at stake here is not so much liberalism, but neoliberalism. And I think that same care which was given to thinking about other concepts, somehow liberalism is seen as this kind of big fluffy thing. But actually there are various variants of liberalism, and what are we seeing in relation to how neoliberalism operates as a political and economic project with linked to very strong states. Because it demands that, linked to because it has a very particular economic project which it requires states to kind of push through. And that conception is more or less linked to that neoliberal economic and political project, which requires very strong sovereign states and also a very conflictual global political order, is, I wonder, something that you're talking about rather than liberalism per se, if you see what I'm saying.
Yes, that's another excellent question. Thank you very much. I forgot the first question already. The second question is related to, I think that you mentioned about too, the entanglement between authoritarianism and liberalism, which, however, is unfortunately the dichotomization of it is leading the current political imaginations or popular understanding of world politics. It's a lot of, I think in a lot of popular imagination nowadays related to our contemporary politics are centered around implicit dichotomization between authoritarianism and liberalism. And you're very right that liberalism must be deconstructed in the sense that it has a lot of different things, and neoliberalism is only one phase of it. But in terms of sovereignty, it does, the idea of liberalism or the autonomous individual is itself, if we go back to European history, it's itself central to the development of modern state sovereignty in Europe back in the 16th century and 17th century, where the Westphalia was developed, where earlier, Rousseau and also the Leviathan, and those liberalist concepts and understanding and rationales were central to the development of, or the conceptualizations of sovereignty in the Western world. So I totally agree with you that we need to untangle it and find a way to understand the relationships of the many different versions of liberalism. But I do still think that how do we understand the autonomy of the individual is central to our current political imagination at this point. I don't yet have a very good way of dealing with it. But the autonomous individual agency is something that we have to find a way to grapple with in a lot of our contemporary political imaginations. Because we are using that concept to drive a lot of our political imagination. It itself reverberates in difficult ways, because the unity of the self is always a myth too. But when we talk about political agency or political participation, we also need that concept to sort of assert rights, right? To assert justice, assert a lot of different things. So how we deal with this individual is still something that I think sovereignty is one way of entering, precisely because it's so problematic. And we all know that sovereignty is a bad word. But if we come back to the core of it, it's about why is it so alluring? Precisely because it empowers an individual autonomous entity. It could be a person, and it could be a group, and it could be a state. So how do we deal with it is my problem and my questions. And at this point, I can only point out the difficulties instead of saying there's an alternative way of thinking about it, because in a way, I don't think there is an alternative one. What we can do is to hold on to it, understand the problems, and continue with it. The awareness is itself, I think, a political participation, political commitment. So that's my not very sophisticated way of responding to your second question. And your first question is about, sorry, was it the first question? That's it.
We can catch up on it.
Yes.
Hi, thank you very much. I just had a question I wanted to ask about the concepts of sovereignty, and maybe take the questions that have already been asked about it in a slightly different direction, which is, you mentioned the term universal several times, that it is so ubiquitous, and that we need sovereignty because it is desired, essentially, everywhere. And that's the way you also handle it vis-a-vis decolonial or indigenous conceptualizations that come against it, right? But if that's the case, my question is, if this ubiquity of sovereignty is so powerful, what work does it do that other forms, other concepts do not? This is, to me, this posing questions. This question poses itself in view of our discussion here today, and it seems to me that might not even be answerable in the terms that we're talking about here today, because it might be more apt to think about that kind of work in terms of psychic or unconscious levels. And in that sense, the question becomes, what form of enjoyment does sovereignty induce or solicit that other concepts do not, or do they not? Maybe they do. Maybe concepts like justice or equality solicit that kind of enjoyment.
Yeah, I very much. This is a great question. Again, I think there's definitely a psychological dimensions to it, and that is the reason why I mentioned very quickly about the concept of empathy. I think that empathy could be one way of thinking beyond sovereignty, but I do not go into detail of it because it's beyond me in a way, and I don't want to go too far away. But I think the idea of sovereignty could somehow develop a certain kind of intercultural and international, intersubjective relations, in the sense that, for example, as I mentioned, a lot of indigenous groups are fighting for their sovereignty, in the sense as a lot of British people think that they need their sovereignty back too. So we're talking about extremely, completely different political, cultural, economic situations. But sovereignty does have allure to many different kinds of people in different situations, precisely because, after all, this can be a very hidden, a psychological desire or needs. So that, in that sense, like all these buzzwords, gaining popularity, particularly in this period of the world. I mean, in the way that we are all entrenching in different humanity crises, and these terms could be helpful because it elicits a certain intercultural connections that might ultimately be able to help us go beyond the concept or the constraints of the concept. So we can start with the concept and, as you say, to find ways to go beyond it within the discourse itself would be, I wouldn't say ideal, but that is productive politics, I do believe. Thank you.
So I think we've literally hit exactly 11:25, and it's time for a break. So please join me in thanking Professor Chiang.